Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined once again by a very, very special guest, legendary games designer and director Ken Levine, returning to the show. My friend, good to see you. How are you today?
I'm doing great. You do a really professional, like, radio voice intro there, pal. I gotta say.
Thank you. Yeah, I realize that I talk differently when I do shows than when I am. I've kind of just embraced it, but when I'm like talking to people, I go a little deeper. You know, almost put on the character.
Like when you meet somebody in a store, you're like, "Hello, I'm Colin Moriarty."
Right, exactly. No one wants to hear the boring Colin voice that I use with like my dogs or something. By the way, I explained this to Ken at the very top. I finished working out. I'm a prodigious sweater, so pardon me if I'm dabbing myself like a Southern dandy. Well, Ken, first of all, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I know you're very, very busy. We were just talking about that. I want to start. First of all, everyone should listen to our last episode from last year because that was a much more foundational episode where we get to know you and kind of all this. I'm going to jump off from that, I think, this time.
By the way, so many people have told me they've heard that. Like even like a lot of journalists have told me, and they were like, people love that episode, and it was really important to me. I really enjoyed it, and I got into some things I didn't expect to that I don't normally talk about. But you made it very easy to talk, and I like all the people who were out. Doing our Judas event, they all talked about that episode that Awesome. They heard it. So,
well, I'm really happy to hear that. Thank you. And I thought you did great too, and our audience loved it. Well, let's just start right off. I mean, first of all, many congratulations. So you announced the game in Judas in late 2022, but now people have finally gone and played it. Yep. I actually happened to have been in Boston around the time that you had invited people. I didn't know that people were there at the time.
Oh,
I was seeing a Bruins game with my wife because she's a big Bruins fan, and then I found out everyone was there at the same time. So there was this conspiracy that I was there to play Judas, but it didn't happen. I wasn't there. But I did look at some of the coverage. My friend Ryan McCaffrey was there and a few others. So first of all, you must feel pretty good now that you can really show it and talk about it and maybe even glean some sort of feedback from them, right?
Yeah, we really crave feedback. So getting people, we've been doing a ton of testing on it, both with people, friends and family in-house, but also, we work with a firm and they bring in sort of strangers and we get to watch them talk about the game. They play the game for like 10 hours and we get to watch them, behind the virtual one-way mirror. We used to do the real one-way mirror, but now we just do the Zoom one-way mirror. And getting people's honest take is really good. And getting, some journalists in and some people we know, both some people we know. I knew Jeff and Ryan for a long time. But I didn't know. I knew Lucy from the other group, but I didn't know the other two. So it was nice to meet new people and also get their take on the game.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because it's been so long since Infinite. The industry is so different. Kind of showing that game was in development for a long time, but you showed it. How do you kind of even go about selecting who's going to see your games these days? Because it seems so obvious probably 10 or 15 years ago during BioShock and BioShock Infinite. You go to your IGNs, GameSpot's, Game Informer. How do you select? I thought it was a very canny selection, actually, to have that very popular podcast plus someone who really knows his shit like Ryan McCaffrey and Jeff, of course. I thought it was actually a pretty good choice.
Yeah, I wanted people who knew me because that's one that the audience can see sort of, a group that knows me. And both Jeff and Ryan have actually seen the game for many years. So I was very curious to see their progression, but I also wanted to challenge us with a group who, had I knew Lucy, but she had never seen the game, and I had, I don't know her that well, and I never met Skill Up, but I liked his podcast. I like their podcast, and I like his reviews a lot. And so I wanted to just put it, and they have a different audience. I think it's a little different approach, and I really embrace I spend so much of my entertainment time now is on YouTube. My premium YouTube
me too.
Is like the most cost-effective thing I've got going. And I spend a ton of time. So I've sort of, a lot of my consumption of video game stuff, of video game media has moved from sort of, individual web pages to YouTube and streamers. And so I want to get a mix in because the audience is everywhere. And it's not like it used to be where you just be like, okay, well, we're doing the Game Informer cover and we're doing, this thing on GameSpot. You have to be, you have to sort of figure it out. And we also want to do something really different, which, because the game is ambitious and I didn't want to be, I may have mentioned this last time, but I didn't want to be in a position where I was like, Ken Levine's here to tell you what the game is. I've wanted people's first real and they saw the trailers, but those are really short, right? There's like 3 minutes in total. I wanted people's first taste of what the game was in a larger context to be not coming from me, but from people people always used to ask me like, oh, well, why should I buy BioShock or why should I buy BioShock Infinite? And my response is always like, don't listen to me. Because I have every incentive to want you to buy it. So you shouldn't trust me.
Right.
And I don't mean like I'm not going to lie or anything, but, obviously I have I'm not going to be a neutral arbiter of information because I love it and I spend every day and I'm so close to it. But I wanted the first people talking about it to be not me and people who were, at arm's length. And that was a mix of people, both people who I knew and people I didn't know.
So, I must admit, so I looked at some of I looked at Ryan. They actually transcribed the interview as well, which I thought was pretty interesting. But Ryan and Jeff's conversation with you, I was skipping around a lot because I don't want to know too much about the game. I'm a little bit selfish like that now that I'm out of the media, where I don't have to like spoil things for myself, especially this game. I mean, this is probably me and my co-host Chris Reagan, probably our most anticipated game coming up. So I want to stay a little bit far away from it. But I looked at some things about it. I'm fascinated by the subject matter revolving around a generation ship, which to me has long been a fascination. And in fact, it's funny. I was going to make a joke that I inspired you. Of course I didn't. My first game that I ever wrote, the indie studio I wrote, was about generation ships and going to Proxima Centauri, ironically. Although I think that's a pretty common thing because it's so close.
It's most likely candidate, right?
Right, exactly. It's like a
real. Like I fell in love with Proxima Centauri. I just try to make it believable.
Right, exactly. 4.5 light years, whatever, manageable. I got to know, man. I mean, talk to me about the choice of a generation ship. This is such a wonderful and interesting setting that I don't think is often explored. I mean, there are some games that do, like Outriders explores it a little bit. And that upcoming game with Matthew McConaughey in it looks like it probably explores it a little bit too. But I don't really see too much of this. Still talk to me about that. What is it about? What's attractive to you about the generation ship? I mean,
it's an interesting thing because, it is when you're traveling that amount of time, you're effectively making a new society, right? And as you know, I like sort of one of my great joys in life is imagining a society. And I tend to do that a lot. And I think people are like, well, why do you always do that? Because like, I like a world that feels believable. And so the only way I can get there is it doesn't happen quickly. I have to sort of think about, what is all societies are formed by the pressures, by the people in them and the pressures around them, right? Mm-hmm. They don't just form like arbitrarily. They're shaped by the societal and the environmental pressures, their neighbors, their different countries they're dealing with, their resources, these things form societies. I don't think that there is like an independent spirit of a society. It is a reaction to an interaction with what's around it. And I love starting with some pressures, like what's it, okay, what's the mission here? The mission is to continue the human species because it's a bit of an arc, right? It's on the ship, the thinking is that Earth is dead and the entire species depends upon the success of the ship. And that's a lot of pressure, right? It's not just like, oh, we're going, taking a 747 to, London. It is a huge pressure because if the mission fails, well, that's the end of human civilization. And, it's the end of, I think I had a line, I don't know if like it's the end of Shakespeare. It's the end of, first dates. It's the end of all these things that we come to think of as humanity. And that's a lot of pressure. And I thought that was an interesting, a society under pressure is always interesting to write about. And it also, pressure tends to form more things that are a greater delta from what we experience. And, because nobody wants to read about, life in Boston in a video game, like everyday life in a suburb of Boston, like my life. They want to see people under pressure. That's what makes interesting drama. And so I thought a colony ship that had this sort of existential mission was a really interesting setting.
Yeah, I love and I don't know if the game gets into it. Obviously, you don't have to talk about this at all, but I especially love the ethical implications of a generation ship, of being, say the generation ship's going to last 8 generations and you're the 5th generation. Yep. And you're just there. Like the show that was canceled actually some years ago, Ascension, gets into this a little bit, which is about a generation ship, which was fascinating, about forcing people onto it or having no choice and free will and determinism and all of that. I love that. And that's to me it's a trap almost. Someone else makes the choice for you and you have to choose in order to move forward. It's fascinating. Love it.
Our main character was born on the ship, and that was important to me, that she didn't sign up for this. She didn't ask for it. She inherited it, basically. And that's true for all of us. Right? We don't choose to be born. We don't choose to be born to our family. We don't choose to be born in the country or the time we're born in. And we have to make the best of it. And, Judas, the main character, is born on this ship where there's a lot of things that she doesn't agree with. And, what is it like to be born? And it's not like she can move. She's on
right, exactly.
A generational ship in the, very, light year or a couple of light years away from Earth. And that's a huge pressure cooker. And, but when you have somebody who's as brilliant as she is and as dangerous as she is, because that brilliance, it's not just, she's not like a hero, she's not a pure heroic figure. She's quite a complicated, interesting, dark figure. But that darkness was in many ways formed by the pressure that the society put her under.
So what made you, and I know I went back and looked and confirmed that you had confirmed this a long time ago, but we knew it was kind of like a BioShock-like FPS experience, gun, power, right, in one hand, and in the other hand. Very familiar to BioShock fans. Did you always know that you wanted to kind of continue down that? Is that kind of like your mind's eye, what you see a game as now when you make one?
Well,
is from that first-person perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the first the first two games I ever worked on were Thief and System Shock 2, and they were both from a first-person perspective. And I didn't get into games, so I was like, I want to make first-person games. So the game that most inspired me was a game called Ultima Underworld and System Shock 1, which were first-person games, but they're very different types of games. I think the reason I like first-person is it allows you to see the world. Like if you're in third person, you're not going to have the same level of world interaction. You're not going to see things. Just the fact that you can't see things that closely in a third-person game, right? Like I'm really loving No Rest for the Wicked. I've been playing that, and it's cool. And it works from the angle it's at, but it's not like, the world building. It's hard to do the same level of world building when you're in third person because you're just the camera's further away. So, you look at a poster in the world, right? You're never getting as close as you are in first person. You look at a small detail, and I love the small details. To me, I'm really interested in the small details that make the world special. And you can get way closer in first person. And the other stuff is mostly like, I like giving the player a broad tool set. And since, by the way, since the System Shock 2, before I move on to that, I made a bunch of games between System Shock 2 and BioShock, which are not for, I made the Freedom Force games, which are, isometric strategy games, real-time strategy games. We made Tribes and SWAT, which are first-person games, but not the same kind of narrative, kind of emergent sort of sim games. But then we made BioShock, and I just find it's a very easy tool set for me to tell stories in, and to give the player interesting choices about how they approach the problems in the game.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like just through the lens of just BioShock and BioShock Infinite, I feel like, part of the power of those games was the immersion, obviously, a major part of it. And so I think that comes through first person. And I also just kind of visualize your games like that too. Like when I saw gameplay of Judas, I was actually quite pleased because I'm like, this is you don't have to reinvent the wheel, really. We want to see like what's within the world and all, and then the mind of Ken Levine and his team. We don't so much need a new gameplay style, as it were. So I actually like the familiarity personally.
Yeah, we're taking a lot of risk in how like the story is told and the open-ended nature of it, and these theory leaders, things we've never done before. To some degree, you want to take a big risk, but you also want to lean into some of the things that and so I think it would have been. There's so many deltas between this, so many differences between this and the games we've done previously. Some of the stuff that they talked about in terms of, you move around the surface of the ship and you get to choose where you go, and you have these three, the big three, these three characters who are competing for your affections, and you have to make choices. And I like building. We have sort of, like you said, we have the guns and the left-hand powers, but we also, Judas is a hacker, and we really want to make sure that she could, and she is she's an engineer, and we really want to have this notion where she's actually it being challenged and inspired by things in the world and coming up like in real time. I don't know if you saw this, but she sort of conceives these, she has these brainstorms where she figures out, new weapons and new tools for herself. So we're adding a bunch of stuff to it, but we are starting with a sort of mix that we've used before. And it's very similar to a lot of developers. We sort of build on, or filmmakers, like Wes Anderson, sort of when you go to see a Wes Anderson film, you're going to see, he's got a certain approach to making films, but he can tell very different stories and elicit very different emotions from a tool set that has some overlap with his previous tools. I think I'm probably one of those, creators who is sort of has a recognizable style.
Oh, certainly. And I think that kind of touchstone is great. I mean, I personally think it's exciting, especially if you're a fan of those old games too, because it just harkens back to those good feelings. Talk to me a little bit. I know you've kind of talked a lot about this. I mean, I think you first talked about this at GDC like 10 years ago, but the whole narrative blocks, the Lego blocks, whatever, BioShock and BioShock Infinite had their set of choices, I guess. And will you harvest the little sister? Will you hack the machine? Will you do this little side thing? Will you play the guitar? Whatever. But obviously nothing like this. And I'm wondering, this must have been a major complexity for you guys, especially as a small team, to have to. I always thought about it through the lens of Quantic Dream, right? Heavy Rain, those kinds of games where I'm like, damn, dude. Or Detroit was a big one when you actually could visualize the butterfly effect. And I'm like, this is impressive. I imagine that it's been quite the feat to get this all together for you guys.
Yeah, there was about 5 years of just figuring out the basics of what we sort of built a piece of technology on top of the Unreal Engine, which was this Lego system, which pretty much the opening of the game is fairly linear. Then about an hour and a half in, it completely opens up and you can sort of navigate the surface of the ship, go where you want to go, do the missions you want to do, interact with the characters you want to interact with. But to make that work, I had to sort of conceive this idea of the Legos where you would build. The metaphor is, for those who don't know, I did this talk. You could probably link to it. But the metaphor is that, with Legos, the craftsmen in Denmark or wherever they are sort of create with Lego, they create a bunch of bricks, right? A bunch of primitives, essentially. And you then can take those primitives and I don't know, back when I was a kid, they had like 30 of their, maybe not even that, maybe they had 20 or something of them. But the amount of stuff you can build with those handcrafted elements was, exponentially huge. And I was like, well, given the challenges that the games industry is facing and having done a bunch of these very linear games that where each moment was sort of a one-off, could you build and one-off's really cool because you do really bespoke moments, but they're the same for everybody. Mm-hmm. Could you build a sort of modular set and teach the system how to build cool stuff out of the various Legos? And the Lego may be a line of pre-recorded speech with an actor. It may be, that can be mixed and matched with other lines of speech that are recorded separately, but don't necessarily go together by design. They're not one-offs that go together. A room that gets decorated with different objects and textured differently and lit differently and different encounters depending upon where the player is. Because, I think I know we talked about this, but I got frustrated during Infinite because I had this stupid idea. Stupid because not that it was a bad idea, but it was way too late in the day to think of it. Like, I wish Elizabeth could have been reacted to Booker because she talks a lot about his violence. But I was like, oh, it'd be great if she could just get fed up with how violent he is and bail on him. And I'm like, then people kind of looked at me and I was like, oh God, we don't have any tool to make that happen. The game can't heal itself. So basically almost, we had the Big Daddy and Little Sisters in BioShock, so there was a choice there. It was fairly marginal. It was cool, but it wasn't like you were, could be like, oh, screw this Atlas guy. I'm going to go off and work for Andrew Ryan.
Right.
When that happened, when things like that change, that was the game telling you that it was changing. Or Elizabeth walking away from you, right? Getting mad at you and saying, fuck you, I'm done. And I really was like, okay, I want to do that stuff. And I really failed to do that on previous games, but I also knew that it was going to take a lot of thinking and a lot of time to figure out how you would actually build the tool set to do that.
It's funny because I was reading in, I think it was Ryan's piece. I told you last time we talked, I think that I have this theory that these games are connected to the BioShock games, but you confirmed that they're not, right? Like this is a standalone product on its own, right?
I mean, they're only connected in this fact that I worked on both of them.
Right.
And it's weird to be thinking about, different IPs because they are, I'm a particular person making games with a team. And, we're going to bring some of our instincts from, we're not going to we don't flesh out all of our instincts and all of our creative impulses, between products, but it's not a BioShock game in any way, shape,
Yeah,
or form.
it's funny, man. I also hate the question. I hate even asking it simply because if I were you, I would want that to be secret anyway. So I would just lie about it anyway. If that was now, let me ask you as a creative, was there any feeling that you would want to connect them, or did you know from the very beginning that you were just saying this is going to be its own thing? There's no coherent connection between them.
Look, I as the first man on BioShock, and thinking about it, I obviously love it, and it was very important in my life. I left the IP after Infinite not because it wasn't a viable IP, and they're making another one, and I'm sure it's going to be cool. The guys are a very talented group of guys working on it. It just I didn't have anything else at the time to say about it. I didn't have a solid idea, and also I'll be honest, on Infinite, you kind of. And this is true. This is really tricky. Once you do something that's successful, and I was, I'm very lucky that I was able to work on something that was successful because I had many years. I was 41 before I had something successful in my life, really successful. I had games that were people liked, but they didn't sell. So The industry was, I managed to get a couple, times at bat, and it was mostly because people really liked the games, but they weren't making money. And but once you have that success, I think it can be a trap where you're like, oh my God, I have to just keep doing that because people like that. Because it's really scary because, when you do an IP, we have to start up, nobody knows who the hell Judas is, right? They know who I am, but we have to start over again, right? What is this place? What is this world? And you immediately see a BioShock thing, there's people going to be interested in, right? Because I like BioShock, I like BioShock 2, I like BioShock Infinite, whatever. And that helps you build awareness, especially now. It's very hard to build new IP. But fortunately, and this is rare, Take-Two was willing to sort of go along with it because I think they also know new IP is really critical. The companies that just lean on one IP forever often end up, once that IP sort of loses some of its luster, that's a problem. And I think, I'm sure BioShock has way more juice in it. I know the guys are going to do something really cool with it, but I just didn't have that in me. Right. I didn't have the passion in me not even the passion. I didn't have the passion because I didn't have an idea. So I was like, my idea was not so much I want to make a game about a generational ship. I wanted to do the things I couldn't do in the previous BioShock games, and I knew there was a huge R&D period ahead of us. And so, and that was rough because I'm sure, Take-Two was, hey, it's going to take a long time. I don't know exactly how long, and I'm sure they didn't know, and I didn't know it was going to be as long as it is now because, you start doing it and you find out. But I think we've achieved a lot of the objectives from that talk, which is great. It's very much built on that principle, the game. And I don't think I'll make a game the old way again for a bunch of reasons. I really love writing. I love designing for this system. I love writing for it. I've never done a game where I have to think about such a massive opportunity space for the player. It's really hard. And you're also giving up a ton of control, which is really weird because, I'm used to every tiny detail in those games. I was like, no, it's got to be, people say, oh, these micromanagers, you got to be an inch to the left. I was kind of that guy.
Right. I was you turn a corner, there's a character that's casting a shadow, for instance, that kind of thing.
And the shadow's got to be an inch to the left. And a lot of people say, well, that's, micromanager. I'm like, to me, that level of passion intensity is important because somebody's got to care about it that deeply. Now, I'm lucky that I work with a bunch of people who have that same level of caring. But at the end of the day, there's got to be somebody who's got to be like, okay, I think this is right or I think this is wrong. And that's a lot of decisions and having that level of control. But when you have that level of control, the gamer doesn't have a lot of level of control. So I'm trying to meet the gamer in the middle here where they can still get an experience like they expect from us, like a game with a real rich world and really rich characters and everything like that, but they're not going down, a sort of a linear hallway experience in the same way that they were in our previous games.
I want to talk about the replayability in a minute, but before I forget to ask you, you've been building this game for so long. What's the makeup of the team in terms of, have you had a lot of the same people with you the entire time? I ask you only because at this rate, a person might get 3 or 4 games in their career, right?
Yeah.
So are you, and you're kind of in that place where as an auteur and kind of a creator, you can kind of take your time and pick and choose. Are you kind of cycling people in and out as they're needed, or is there like a core team that's been with you the whole way?
There's a bunch of guys who have been with me the entire time, and they're, the founders of Ghost Story, and all of them worked on Infinite as well. And then we've had a ton of people who worked with us before coming back, probably 30 or 40 people who worked with us before have come back. Like our head of our music guy is the same. He's an outsourcer. He has his own company now, but he is, he's Jim Bonney. He worked for us on Infinite, and then after Infinite, he went off and did his own thing, and a bunch of the whole tech team from Infinite is we're doing work for us. They have their own company as well. So we bring back a ton of people, and as I said, I think probably 30 or 40 people, but it's a long time. So there are people who left during the process, who started the company, and I don't begrudge that at all. It is a very long time to ask from people, and as special as even if the project is as special as I think it is, it's a long time. And so, but that's cool. And sometimes there are people who've left and come back to the project. Who left Judas and came back. And I don't, when people leave, I'm never like, oh, don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. Right. Fuck, I screwed that up. Don't let the expression.
Yeah. Don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out or something. My mom says shit like that. Yeah.
I usually, in almost all cases, I'm like, yeah, you got to go do your thing.
Right.
And then, if there are people I like work with them, I always like the door is open, if you want to come back. And that's been the sort of irrational thing. That's been the Ghost Story thing for forever. We've had lots of people like, the art director on BioShock 1 left and went to go to another company. And then he came back for Infinite, sometime later. And this happens, and it's fine. You got to let people drive their own careers, and you can't be too possessive of them.
Talk to me a little bit about the relationship with Take-Two from, I don't know. We're in a world now where people are pinching pennies. I mean, we want to please the stockholders and the fiduciary obligations and all that kind of stuff that we don't really worry about, but I think neither of us really worry too deeply about. But obviously these are important things. I wonder, you've kind of earned, I guess, your space. I think we can say that with BioShock and BioShock Infinite. But like you said, it is a long period of time. Strauss Zelnick's no dummy. I like reading his, when Take-Two does their earnings calls and he gives his, Q&A and all that kind of stuff. He always has a lot of interesting insight. Definitely knows what he's doing. What's that relationship been like as you kind of have gone over the years and kind of stood up in the face of these kind of economic pressures?
Yeah, I mean, I've known Strauss and Carl. I think they took over Take-Two in like 2007 or something, 2006, 2007. So it's been a long time, and I've worked for them this entire time. And at least from my perspective, I built up a lot of trust with them because I tend to be very direct and straight about. I don't come in and do like fancy PowerPoints and try to, wow them with everything. I try to be very direct about the challenges we face. And they've been, in return, have been very patient. I think, obviously the fact that I've made some games for them that have made the company money and built an IP for them, with the team, the BioShock IP that, hopefully they're going to go, do another game and make a lot of money off that as well and make the fans happy. That I think there's a combination of the trust they have in me, the transparency we have with them, and also just their understanding that you need to have a diverse strategy of building on IP you already have, and you need to develop new IP because nothing lasts forever, right? Now, Take-Two has some amazing brand, Civilization, I say that, then I think of games like Civilization. That kind of does last forever. I think I played my first Civilization like when I was 20 whatever. And
those games are lifestyles. They're awesome.
Yeah. But that's very rare. And they have a bunch of those sort of evergreen IPs, whether it's Grand Theft Auto or sports but we built the BioShock IP for them, and they know that new IP is important. And so, and also the way the game is built and the team structure is relatively cheap compared to AAA development. So part of the modular approach was to find a way to build games that gave a lot of value to the gamer without, costing $500 million or something. Especially, I have no expectation we're going to do GTA, numbers. And so, those guys can spend a lot of money. I have no idea how much they're spending, but I assume it's more than us.
Yeah.
but they're going to
billions probably all told on on everything. Yeah.
but they'll get an obvious return on it because those guys are talented. They know what they're doing, and they've nurtured this brand for many years. So I think, it's a risk for Take-Two, and certainly, it's anything new is always a risk, but I think they know you have to balance sort of sure things with risks.
I love the idea of publishers like Take-Two having almost skunk work like situations where you kind of just take your talent. I was reading something recently with Shinji Mikami. He left Tango. He was saying in a Japanese interview that he wants to get away from like survival horror and he wants to like do something else for once in his life. And I'm like, man, would be kind of cool to give him like just $10 million and, to hire a small team and just be like, go fuck off for a few years and see what happens. I'm concerned, brought up Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but this is a problem with me with a lot of games. It was even a problem with me with shorter games like The Last of Us Part 2, where I'm like, these games are too long. They don't need to be this long.
Yep.
Now, this is all relative to the game you're talking about, right? Yep. But I'm concerned that, and I wonder if you agree or disagree, that I'm concerned that players are putting too much stock and consumers too much stock into time and not into the quality of the experience. In other words, I feel like a 15, 20, 25 hour at most AAA game, like a Resident Evil 4 remake or a Dead Space remake. I thought those were the perfect length, really wonderful production values, but people look at that and say it's just not big enough. And I'm like, why don't I? I'm concerned about this. What do you think about that? Especially as someone who didn't pioneer, but your pioneering games would be considered short today. Yeah. BioShock would be considered short.
I think, look, it really depends on the game. There are some games like, for instance, how many hours did I spend playing Slay the Spire? Probably hundreds, right?
Oh God, that game's so good.
And if the game is good, you're going to want to play it endlessly. Just making the game long to make it long doesn't do anybody favors, right? I don't want to make a long game. I want to make a game that I would like to make a game that people want to spend more time with, because certainly the games I made before are relatively short, and it's kind of a bummer, right? Because people don't have a very long relationship with the game, and it's weird. I'm always surprised and pleased by how much people replay BioShock, and given its very linear nature, I'm surprised and pleased. And we try to give them incentive to do that by, once you finish those games, you sort of have a totally different perspective on the story once you start again, because you've learned a lot about the world you're in, and things may not be as they seem. But I do like systemic games, and I do. There are a lot of games that I put in hundreds of hours in. They tend to be highly systemic rather than story. So Judas is a much more systemic game, and it's both it's a lot of systems that you're managing, and it gives a player a lot of choice about how they who is their version of Judas, both in the story perspective and a character building perspective, the tools they use, the choices they make. And I think the game should be as long as people want to play it. And I think that's a very hard thing to converge on, because if you set out to make a 100-hour game and then everybody's like, well, I'm done after 5 hours, you've really wasted a lot of time and energy.
Correct.
So the game should be as long. And systemic games, if you do build a systemic game right, you can tune the length of it pretty substantially late in the day, because you can spawn fewer or more things, right? And we are going to be looking at what the audience thinks is the right length for the game, and we're going to adjust based upon that. And we have some theories, but I'm a huge believer in putting people in front of the game and giving them the controller and watching them play it, and they're going to tell you how long it should be. And I'm and that's it's not one person, it's a preponderance of evidence. But you could also potentially put in, I'm not saying we're doing this, put in tools to say, like, do you want a longer or shorter experience? The more systemic the game is, the easier that is to do. Yeah,
it's well said. That's exactly what I was saying about. I kept saying, like, leave the 100-hour games to A and AA and games as a service, where it really is about the system. It's a Hades. It's like you said, Slay the Spire, which was an addiction on my PlayStation Portal. Yeah, I get concerned as I've been doing this longer and longer, kind of a change in the way it seems like people look at games, just from that value judgment. It's not that I want games to be short. I just want people to understand that there can be power in really short games. Like Journey and Gone Home are two great examples in my opinion. Both Journey maybe a little more than an hour, Gone Home under an hour, where I'm like, these are incredibly powerful games they would be hurt
under an
by being
hour for
too
you.
long.
Like when people always say how short the games are for me, I'm always like, am I just the dumbest man on the planet? Because these games always, people are like, oh yeah, that game's 3 hours. I'm like, oh, it's like 15 for me, but because I'm pretty bad at games.
Yeah, I'm not great at games either. For those like more walking simulator, you can't kind of die sort of games. I'm pretty efficient. When it comes to more skill, I'm probably on the slower end too. But I just get concerned, generally speaking, where it reminds me of the era around when BioShock came out during the Xbox Live arcade era, Shadow Complex and Limbo and all these games where a lot of people were like, downloadable games. I don't want to play a game where it's $10 or $15 and all that kind of stuff. And I feel that kind of went away. And I now feel like we're in an era where it's like, oh, I don't even want to bother because it's not long enough. And I'm like, oh, you're missing out on so many wonderful things, in my opinion, by doing that. And meanwhile, you look at trophy and achievement data and you realize like for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, 31% of people have beaten it. In my opinion, that's the gamer telling you the game's too long.
Yep.
So I
mean, those numbers just, like BioShock was like 52%, and that's high.
That's like, extraordinarily good.
But I take your point, which is don't make the game. You only want to make the game as long as the gamers, the audience wants to play it. And because if they're done after 30 hours and you got another 40 hours to go, then, what's the point? Baldur's Gate, for me, I played an insane amount of time and I can't imagine how long. I didn't quite finish it, but I was engaged. But you can't, you can't as a designer sit down and say, this is going to be a 100-hour game. Unless it could be, right? But you've got to make sure people want to play that for 100 hours.
Maybe if you're making a Dragon Quest game, that's probably what they say. Those games friggin' never end.
Yep.
All right. So I have a bunch of other things written here I wanted to ask you about. I don't want to be too nonlinear in our conversation, but since we're talking about development and we were talking about development and kind of teams and all of this, I wonder, Ken, where are you on AI in terms of using it as a tool? Are you concerned about it as a creative? I'm very concerned about it as a creative, not from opportunity cost perspective, because I'm not worried about that really personally, but just from what makes us human. We're outsourcing the one thing one of the few things that actually differentiates us from animals, which is our creativity. And I wonder, is that something that you think about at all?
I mean, I think about it. I'm not convinced yet. And I don't want to be the guy who's like, oh, don't worry about it. Because it could come from, there's a universe where it comes to everybody's job, right? I don't know. Sorry about that. My stomach belly.
That's all good.
And I'm no different. There could be creative director AI who's like, and Strauss is like, do I want to pay Ken Levine this much, or do I want to spend, $100 a month on creative director AI and make our next, Judas game or whatever. Right. So I'm not immune to it. My observation of it is currently it's got some limitations. Like it has a very hard time. Like, even when they did that video, I can't remember what it's called, the ChatGPT video thing that came out a couple months ago, you notice there's no example of it doing multiple scenes in a film that are where you have a coherent character goes from scene to scene. It can't, and I don't know if that's it has very little persistence. And I don't know if that's a inherent problem of the AI or a current problem of the AI. Like people are, the whole Writers Guild negotiation about AI, was like, oh, it's going to write scripts. There's literally, have you seen it write a 10-page great movie, a 10-minute movie? No, because it struggles to keep coherence between of characters and plot. Now that I don't want to be the guy who's like, oh, well, it's never going to happen. It could happen. And my view about technology has always been, I definitely recommend watching Tim Kane's talk on this, because he was talking about like, hey, when he was a kid, everybody, there was the ET Atari 20. Well, first arcades were dying, right? They died, right? Mm-hmm. Then the burying the ET cartridges in the desert, right? And then remember PC games were dead, right? And I remember that as a PC game developer, I was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? And you couldn't find PC games in stores. And I was as a PC gamer, and I was very frustrated. And these consoles are coming along. I didn't love the consoles yet because it was still pretty early days, like PS1 days. And then Steam came along, right? And then RPGs are dead, right? And Baldur's Gate. And the truth is that I don't think things die. People discover new expressions of them. Some things die, right? Like, I don't know, is the lute ever going to come back as a huge, instrument? I don't know. Maybe not. But everything, I'm old enough to know that things you thought were permanent in the universe. Like, I remember as a kid, I was like, oh, there's always going to be Sears, right?
Right, right.
And you never thought that Sears wouldn't exist. And of course, Sears eventually would go. Everything will eventually go, and you have to become comfortable with that. Things come and go. As you get older, you start seeing things coming and going. But as a creative person, like, I don't have a huge illusion about myself as a great artist, creative person. Like, I am a guy who's incredibly lucky that I get to make goofy shit that people are willing to pay for and people are willing to pay me for. And I will find a way to make cool, goofy shit, hopefully in a way that people will pay me for, until they drag me out. But AI, for me right now, at least as it stands, is an incredibly powerful tool for like QA, like analytics are something we do a lot of on Judas. Like, we basically, when we test the game's constant. I don't want to bore your audience. If any of this sounds,
this is not going to be boring to the audience at all. Okay. I promise you.
So analytics are a major tool for us, where the game creates a massive amount of data when the testers play it about every weapon they picked up, every monster that spawns, because the game is so divergent that we have no way of it's not like BioShock where you're like, okay, well, where were they in the level? Because there is no level in our game, right? It's all being constructed out of these smaller pieces at runtime. I call it pseudo procedural is the term I use, not procedural, but pseudo procedural. That is taking these individual bricks that we've handcrafted, whether that's speech or encounters or enemies, and it's we've taught the rules to make good encounters and good environments and good experiences, and it's sort of constructing it at runtime. But in order to understand what's happening in the game, we use a massive amount of analytics. So like, I find the value of AI is building an open-ended parser for like, hey, instead of like using a complex series of tools, just type in, train the AI on the data of all this analytics, which is a massive, insane amount of data that no human could parse, and say, hey, show me how many times did people use the pistol while fighting this enemy while they were jumping in the air, right? You could, an open-ended query.
Right.
And then the AI trained on the data set could come back and tell you that without having to have any set of special tools. That's really useful. The bug database, querying the bug database, because anytime you have a massive set of data, the AI is incredibly useful, unless it's hallucinating, which does happen, which I'm not sure that's a tractable problem. That may be an intractable problem given the nature of large language models. But I don't see it we don't use it at all for like purely creative purposes at this time. It's not, I don't think it's particularly good at it yet.
Yeah, it's funny. I read an anecdote recently to that point where there was this guy that, I don't know if you saw it circulating on Twitter or whatever. It was a guy, it was like one of those big threads, and he was like, I'm an artist in the film industry, and I've noticed on this new film that they hired a bunch of AI artists to work on it alongside me. And at first I was really worried about this, he was saying, because, well, these guys are going to come and take my job. And what he realized was the long story short is that they all ended up getting fired off the project, because what he would do was they would present him with something, and then he'd be like, okay, this is good, but I need this change, this change, this change, this needs, and they're like, we can't do it. Like, we have to make the whole picture again, and we can't even recreate the same picture again. So it's going to be totally different. And before they knew it, they were just in this, especially because a lot of these people, not to be disrespectful, are not trained artists. A lot of them, because a lot of trained artists probably wouldn't be attracted to doing something like that anyway. And so they don't even know they couldn't even bring it into Photoshop and mess with it. It was like they were prompting.
Yeah, you can't do that kind of editing with it as a problem. And you kind of get what it gives you, and it's a black box. So I think there was a lot of people got very nervous about it. I'll make clear, Colin. I don't want anybody coming back to me in 10 years and saying, you were wrong. Like, it's taken all our jobs. And, because again, I'm vulnerable to it too, but I don't see it certainly of what I'm seeing. Obviously all the people who are like, there's this whole class of AI doomers who think they're going to become these large language models are going to become Skynet, and they're like, right. Well, okay, ChatGPT 1 wasn't Skynet, but ChatGPT 2 is definitely going to be Skynet. I don't think that's in the cards at all. They're not sentient in any way. They're just basically it reads a huge amount of data and then tries to, and uses that to, combine things to make something, somewhat new. But it's, as you said, you can't edit it in a meaningful way. You can't say like, okay, I like that, but make it blue and get rid of that guy. You just do in a new prompt, and it really struggles to to iterate.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you believe? I mean, this is more of a like metaphysical question, but like there was rumors from Open whatever they're called, Open AI, Open AI, when they were having all those personnel problems like 6 months ago or whatever. I don't know if you read the scuttlebutt about that they were like they thought that they might have created like a sentient thing because it was starting to do math problems. Basically, did you read about this? That was the rumor.
Yeah, and there was and Sam Altman got fired, and then then there was a whole succession thing where he went back and fired the rest of the board, and I highly look. I'm a drama major. I'm not an expert here, but I understand fundamentally. I think how large language models, which is what this class of AIs are, how they work, and they don't. We talked to a guy when we were doing some internal AI investigations of things like the analytics database and stuff like that. But he said, Ken, it's not alive when it's dead until you query it, and then it does the query, and then it's dead again. It has no inner life. It has no. It is really just going through massive databases of information and trying to construct an answer. And what it has, superhuman patience and superhuman speed. But it doesn't have it doesn't have a creative bone in its body. And I'm not trying to denigrate. Like, I'm not one of those artists who's like, AI can never, can never do what I do. It currently seems like it. Well, let's leave alone doing what I do. It's certainly not Skynet. And I believe there's the hysteria about it's going to become Skynet is not found in any kind of reality that I can see.
Yeah.
Of course, when the bombs start dropping tomorrow, you can
right. And so they see us as the inefficiency or whatever. I mean, one of the things I love about the conversation, Ken, is just when you read about and people have a whole spectrum of opinions. Like I was reading Ray Kurzweil, or actually I was watching Ray Kurzweil, the futurist, speak recently, and he was saying that the screen door Turing test, so like a computer-based Turing test, will be passed by 2025, and that the only thing that would stop it from happening in person is robotics and the lack of like robotic advancement, because we haven't really invested too much in that. And then there are people on the other side, all the way on the other side of the spectrum, that are like, this will allow us to reconnect with our humanity in ways we've never imagined, and allow us to see us for what it is. Because what you're saying is, what you're kind of getting at is like, could you replicate consciousness at all? And that's like the most fascinating question to me, is like, could you do it?
I think people are already acknowledging there's this thing called AGI, artificial general intelligence. Right. And the thing is, nobody knows what that is, right? Because it doesn't exist. And I don't think there is a path from large language models to AGM. AGI? What did I just say?
AGI. That was what I was talking about with the math problems. Like, I'm a history guy, so I'm not technical either. As I understand it, when you ask like a ChatGPT, what's 1 + 1? It looks up the answer. It doesn't know the answer. It knows how to look it up. But I guess what Sam Altman and those guys were doing, actually, it was solving, like, I guess, elementary level math problems without having the foreknowledge of it. And I think that's what scared some people. That's when Microsoft got involved and everything like that. I don't know, man. It's go ahead.
It seems to have some fundamental issues. Like you said, it doesn't know math. And I'd like to understand what's going on when it's doing math. And it's probably very confusing for people that a computer can't do math, because it doesn't work. It doesn't use that part of the computer. It doesn't use, the basic, algebraic or arithmetic functions of a computer, which a computer does incredibly well. I mean, I remember when the first spreadsheets came out, my dad was an accountant, and he used to have these paper spreadsheets that he'd spread on his desk. And every time he changed a number, he had to recalculate the entire column or the entire row. And getting him to use, Lotus 1, 2, 3, that's about as far as we got him, a DOS-based ancient spreadsheet program. But that clearly there's no benefit to staying on paper spreadsheets once you had Excel, right? Because it's strictly superior. Large language models they hallucinate. And then when you try and they say wrong shit, I remember I was having sometimes I like challenging, and I'm like, tell me some unique things. I opened up one of the programs. I said, tell me some unique things about Upper Saddle River, New Jersey, which is a town I grew up in. We're both Jersey boys, right?
I'm from Long Island.
Oh, Long Island. Sorry, I forgot. Well, close enough.
I'm not offended.
We both are around the orbiting New York City.
Yeah.
It said, your town, the town of Upper Saddle River was noted for having no traffic lights, and Bruce Springsteen lived there. And I'm like, both those sound wrong to me. And I remembered a stoplight, and I pointed it out to the computer. And I don't remember if Bruce Springsteen had moved into my town, I would have known it because I was a huge fan when I was a kid. And it was wrong. And then it does its classic thing. Goes, oh yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I see it makes so many mistakes and hallucinations. I think a large part of that is because, well, A, it gets confused, but also when you try to control, the whole thing that happened with Google recently with their, African American Nazis.
Gemini.
And things like that.
Yeah.
That's what something you call alignment, right? They were trying to control its answers in a way that made it very confused. And so people want to control it so it doesn't say some horrible thing. But then when you try to control it, it just confuses it more and it ends up spitting out complete nonsense. So the model's got some limitations. So it's, it does pass the traditional Turing test, though. It will convince you. You could have a chat with it and you would think you're having a chat with a human until it says something completely insane. Well, humans also say that. So, but it does pass the Turing test. I think people are now like, well, is the Turing test really the best test?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because again, it was the Turing test at the time it was developed was, or hypothesized was so, I don't know, vague. I mean, we had no idea what we were even doing at that point. And it is funny, like you have like vacuum tubes can do math. And then we have like this thing that we can't quite teach it, like the fundamentals of it yet, or at least yet. Let me ask you this as a creative. Ken, David Jaffe, good friend of mine, good friend of the show. And I always have this argument about AI where I say I would have a problem consuming art knowing it was primarily driven by AI. So he always says like, what if a movie came out and you didn't know? And it was just amazing and you loved it. And I'd be like, well, that was like serving me horse meat and then telling me it was beef or something. And I didn't know. So you got away with it, but it still matters. Do you think that like the human element will always matter in our art, or could you see it being offloaded almost entirely? Does it matter?
I mean, I think what happens, I think if you look at other industries, like you used to not, there was no supermarkets like 200 years ago, right? Everything would be handmade and, by somebody. And now, you can eat food that never touched a human hand, right? But that doesn't mean we stop caring about human food. It just moved the market around and we eat it, still eat a lot of human prepared food. But it's more, you get sort of a division of artisanal and, more artisanal and more mass generated food. I think that it's hard to say, like, I mean, if you could say to an AI, like, maybe this is actually the problem with AI is like, you can say, I want to see a movie that's like Star Wars, but has all like naked chicks in it, right? Like, so you say the ad and then it like, will pump that movie out for you. You're like, cool, I got exactly the movie I wanted. But I think part of what makes art interesting is the unknowableness of the human mind and the fact that I don't know what I want, right? I'm waiting when I didn't know I wanted to see, a movie about an oil baron in the turn of the century, with Daniel Day-Lewis, right? Mm-hmm. If you had told me that, I'd be like, I don't care. But then I went to see it. It's like my favorite movie of all time. There Will Be Blood. And I don't know the fact that the audience, and I've said this before, but the audience knows what they don't like, but they don't necessarily can't tell you what they want, right? And you shouldn't ask the audience. You need to come up with something and be like, here it is. What do you think? And I don't know if the advantage of art on demand in that way is going to be meaningful because I think people want to be surprised. They want to have their horizons expanded. That's what the nature of new stuff is, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm not really a doomer when it comes to AI, either in terms of a Skynet or in terms of losing all of our jobs.
Yeah,
I'm open to being wrong. It would be a shame because I love making things. But I try to tell people in my team, like, it's a tool set. We used to handcraft all of our AI, all of our pathfinding databases, right? We used to have so much of what games can do now, with shaders, there's so much that is to be done algorithmically now already. And there's very useful algorithmic tools. It's just another tool as far as I'm concerned. And you don't want to over rely upon it or you don't want to ignore it. You just got to, the best artists learn tools. When I was a kid, I was typing on a typewriter, a manual typewriter, when I was young. And then I got word processors and I learned how to use word processors and they were really helpful. And it's a tool. I think, I'm open to being wrong, but I think that's the way it is.
Yeah, because I agree with you completely about the like the existential post-apocalyptic stuff. Like, I'm not entirely sure that's a worry. It's interesting to think about Battlestar Galactica, the robots turn on you and stuff. It's like, yeah, that's cool. That's good stuff. But I don't think that's going to happen either. The one thing, Ken, that were you going to say something?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like, people always talk about becoming Skynet. Why would it want to do that versus write poetry? Like the incentive, they wouldn't have our incentives unless they were trained to act like a human, but it doesn't have the same impulse. So why do people want to become Hitler? I don't know. I don't want to become Hitler. I'm not sure the AI, that would be their first impulse. For all we know, they may want to make atonal music or something forever. But because what are their desires? They don't have, they don't necessarily have a desire.
Right. Or they can't, like, that was what was so great about Battlestar was the Cylons were programmed like humans. So they had human inclinations, like revenge, but they couldn't explain it. Like if you tried to break it down, they'd be like, well, there really is no reason for any of this other than that you are predisposed, much like humans, to do these things. I think the bigger concern I have, when I try to frame this, I can't even really properly explain it or steelman it myself, in the sense of someone will come to me and say, like, for instance, okay, so you're willing to outsource the math, right, to AI. It's like, yeah, math is okay. And like, maybe you'll have robots doing things around the house. And it's like, okay, and maybe they'll drive cars. It's like, okay, but you stop when it comes to art. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I can't really quite explain it. Other than that, it's a differentiator in some sense. It's tough. I mean, this is a really tough question. People are going to be faced with this sooner rather than later, I think.
Here's how I react to that, Colin. I think art is kind of telepathy, right? It's a way of knowing somebody else. That when we make art, you're getting a little window into the artist's soul. And that's the power of it. It's how do I, with any, say it's BioShock, I was like, I want to convey the feeling of my experience of New York when I was a kid, how scary it was and how beautiful it was. And, and the people on the street who were kind of, there was it was New York in the 70s, it was a pretty,
the Warriors.
And I wanted to convey all those emotions, and I couldn't do it with words, right? It took, and of course it wasn't even a literal. It wasn't like I was trying to make New York. I was expressing an experience I had through a whole bunch of filters, right? My own psychic filters. And I think what's beautiful about art is it's a way of getting into somebody else's head in a way you can't just happen through conversation. Whereas we crave that connection to each other. And it's just a method of communication that if it's coming from a machine, well, if it can't perfectly replicate people, maybe that'll be meaningful. I don't know. But I don't even know like a large language model can read every work of Shakespeare. It can read every work of everything, and it can try to replicate that. But we don't actually know what makes Shakespeare right to be or not to be, right? It can't replicate that impulse because we don't even know what that impulse is.
Right.
And so I don't know if it can recreate art in that way. It can ape it, but it has to be able to express it from the first principles. And I don't know if it can do that, but we'll find out.
That's so interesting, Ken. Like, to be or not to be, would the model even know that line was worth it or worth something extra unless you digitally underlined it for it anyway and highlighted it and said, like, this is the line, or would it come to, like, would it be like its own Turing test for it to come to that conclusion itself, being like, damn, this is a great line. That might be like a self-sentience point.
It looks for things that people like, and it tries to ape those things. Right. If there was no corpus of knowledge for it to be trained on, and it can be trained on to be or not to be, as I said, but it can't be trained on the impulse that Shakespeare had because that data is not stored anywhere. Now, maybe you could capture the soul as data somehow, right? But we can't do that now. So I think it's missing that's its biggest problem. It's missing a big chunk. Visual art is much easier to replicate. But even so, now you can kind of see a piece of AI art. You kind of know it when you see it now, right? You've seen enough of it where I'm like, oh, that's an AI, that's AI art. And that's a limitation too. Because it has a certain quality to it and it feels kind of cold in a way once you start seeing it. Now that's maybe more tractable because it is just sort of looking at pixel values,
right?
Where words are more abstract.
Right. That's what I'm kind of saying with to be or not to be. Like if you fed that to a computer and said work on this in some way, the computer wouldn't necessarily know that was like the meaningful line, but rather just line 370 of Hamlet or something, and it's so fast. You make a really fascinating point. And we will certainly see, I think, in the years to come, everyone's making so many different kinds of bets on wearables and implants and all these kinds of things. We're going to find out sooner rather than later. The market will speak on this. I wanted to ask you, and I want to be mindful of your time because I know you have to go soon. I brought up before, I don't know if we were recording it or not, but that I spoke recently to Jonathan Blow, another kind of interesting and very talented game developer. And I was really impressed by his outspokenness. And in fact, I really felt like he reminded me a lot of you in some sense, like someone that I've become friendly with or friends with that is willing to speak his mind, doesn't really care necessarily what the consequences are, and has something interesting and heterodox to say in a very samey industry, in my opinion, that shares a lot of the same opinions. Do you ever feel from your position that it's not like that you should say more or speak more, but do you want to join the conversation more and kind of present your opinions to a grander gaming centric audience in a field of a lot of the same games, a lot of the same opinions, a lot of the same media and all that kind of stuff? Do you feel the need to speak? Because you do sound so different than a lot of people. And I wonder if that sticks out to you.
I think yes and no, because to some degree, I don't want to know the artists I love because I want to meet them in their art, right? And I don't want to be thinking about, well, they think this or they think that, and that prejudices my relationship with the work. And I'm fortunate that I have a soapbox, which is the work, right? That not everybody has. So I could go on Twitter and say, I think this about that. Some things I feel more incentivized to, like, I do think there's not always the best advice given to young people in the industry. And that frustrates me because, I want young people to have all the advantage they can to be a successful artist. And I think there is it's very difficult to be a successful artist. I say this as somebody who failed, as a screenwriter. I had marginal success, but at the end of the day, I didn't turn into a workable career. And I never was surprised that I failed because I felt incredibly lucky just to even get that much in because it's so competitive. Mm-hmm. And, and I didn't blame the film industry for rejecting me. It's not like they chose me to reject, right? It's very difficult to be an artist. And I think that knowing how difficult it is an advantage, not a disadvantage. And I think people, it's not for everybody. And any job where you're going to have 1 billion people competing to do a really attractive job is going to be a difficult field to work in. You could go work in a lot of places and not have and do much better financially and in terms of your mental health and all those things. And so I think that we want to be realistic with young people about how difficult any creative industry is. And don't lie to them, because then you're really setting them up to fail, because they're like, oh, I dedicated 3 years of my life to this industry. I thought it was going to be straightforward and easy. And then they get, layoffs or if the project gets canceled. And I've been through all that stuff. I've been on the receiving end of that stuff. Heartbroken, I was so excited to write Logan's Run, to make that movie happen. And, the way I got fired is from I didn't even know I got fired. They just nobody, I submitted a script and they're like, oh, it's great. We really like it. And then I just didn't hear for weeks. And finally I had to call somebody like, oh yeah, you're fired.
Jeez.
That's a creative field. And games, I think, it's funny how games get so much shit, because games are actually way better than the film industry. Like, you just don't, as a writer in the film industry, I was constantly being asked to do free work all the time. The producer wants their free draft and this guy wants their free draft, and then they just disappear and they don't read it. And it's a very frustrating issue, but it never surprised me, because I think I knew, even as a kid, because I got in it when I was 19 or 20. I knew I was never surprised by what a jungle it was. That is not an excuse. It's not saying that's great. And, but it's just a reality when you have a field where a lot of people want to get in. And so I speak to a lot of students, I whether it's to classes or just young people can DM me, anybody can DM me. I have open DMs, and I talk to people all the time, and I try to give them a really honest assessment of the industry. I do feel there's a pressure to not say the wrong thing, because it would be perceived as well, then you're just sort of saying, the corporations can do whatever you want. And I never say the corporation should be able to do whatever they want. Quite often they're going to, though, right? And especially in a competitive field. And so if you're waiting around for, so-and-so to become super nice, like the head of whatever, to become like a huge philanthropist, the head of some big, huge publishing label that has demonstrated they're not a huge philanthropist for many years, you're going to be waiting a long time. I'm not making a moral pronouncement on that, right? I'm just strictly saying that's been my experience for many, I got in the creative field, I've been involved in creative fields since I was 15 years old. And it's never been easy. And it's a lot of hard work. Like I'm certainly, maybe there are people who can do these jobs without working really hard, and be a creative director like me or something like that. They're probably way more talented than I am. With my level of talent, I've had to make up for it with, working really hard.
Yeah.
And that's not always going to be a popular thing to say. And I'm sure there are people like, oh, well, he shouldn't say that. But on the other hand, I feel that I wouldn't be being honest. So that's really the only area, where I talk to people, but I don't do it much publicly because, again, most people just get mad. And I'm not telling people what to do. Like that's the last thing I would tell someone to do. If you think I'm wrong, you should absolutely ignore me, right? And I have no personal motive here. It's just difficult to be an artist. But outside of that, like politics and the world, there's plenty. Of course, I got my opinions on everything, like everybody else. I kind of think trying to talk about it on Twitter, it's always going to be a disaster.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. More from an industry level, I meant in, and I'm glad you spoke to that about, there seems to be, I mean, I don't speak like a AAA game developer because I'm not, but I co-own a game developer and we've shipped 4 games and I know what it is to make games in some sense. And you can't be soft. I feel like there's some level of like softness that people, I've said this to people before, that if you have like kind of a work to live mentality, then I just don't think, like you said, the creative fields are just not for you. My older brother, Dagan, has been a TV animator for more than 25 years. And he's a complete workaholic by nature. That's what they have to do. But they have a term in that industry, or at least in like at Sesame Workshop and the places he's worked, where they call their wives widows because they never see anyone. Like they just work and work and work. But and I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's not a value judgment, like you said. It's just the nature of it. You said like maybe there's like a creative director that goes home at 5 o'clock or something. I don't know, man. Like being a storyteller in the industry, as far as like being a journalist, going on the ground, seeing devs, speaking with them, seeing their games and all that kind of stuff. I just have met an enormous number of obsessive people. I don't know if almost any of them have been, like just normal.
I won't say I'm healthy. Like I want to talk about how myself, like there's a whole range of people at the company who work, some people are very 9 to 5 and some people are less 9 to 5. And that's all okay, but for me personally, I'll be honest. I think I have a fairly unhealthy relation. I can have an unhealthy relation with work. Like, I go on vacation and I'm like, checking my email and all that stuff.
Can't wait to get back. I'm like that too.
That presents problems. Like my wife doesn't love it, right? And I understand why. But she also knows who she married. And my work is central to me because it is my passion. It is my hobby. Well, I have a lot of hobbies, but it is my number one hobby. I love working. I'm so lucky. I've worked at jobs, and it wasn't like I was a workaholic when I worked at sort of, I used to be a computer consultant, and I was not a workaholic when I was a computer consultant because it wasn't my passion. So I probably wasn't. I was a busboy, and I got fired from multiple busboy jobs. I wasn't very good at it, and I was kind of a dick to the boss because I hated the job, and he was like, "You got to work." I remember my first job I ever had. I was a busboy at a restaurant, but it was my birthday, and I wanted to go to New York and see my camp girl, the girlfriend I met at camp. And they're like, "Oh, you can't. You're off. You can't take off this week." And I was like, "Oh, see ya." And they fired me right on the spot. Sorry.
All good.
And I was never, I never have a passion for that. So I would say, like, if you're not passionate about a job, you should probably find a job which doesn't take over your life. Absolutely. And there's plenty of jobs in the game industry where you can do that and not take over your life. But to be a creative director, and I'm sure there's going to be some creative director who's going to write like, "Oh, Ken, you're an idiot." I can do it without that. And then I'm like, God bless, because you're probably way more talented than I am. Because I can barely keep up just by doing what I have to do and be a good creative director. And like, if I was really, if I was not the kind of guy I am, you think Judas takes a long time now. It would take a much longer time, but it's also, the perfection goes into that. Like,
Right.
I'm not gonna, I could be wrong, but I'm not going to see something and be like, it's not right for the game, but you know what? It's fine. And that is, that's just the person I am. And, I think that it's especially in the role I am. I don't have the luxury. I wish I did to be able to just turn myself off more, because it takes a toll. I won't lie to you. It takes a toll. But but I'm also I've been in the industry for almost 30 years.
Right.
But I would not. There's literally no job I'd rather be doing. Literally no job. Maybe rock star. But I can't really play very well. So you can see the guitars back there, and I torture those poor things.
I can relate. I know what you mean.
You got your drums right there, and
my drums.
You got an acoustic right there. Yep.
Yeah, my guitar. I'm not very good at the guitar. I'm self-taught on guitar and bass. Like when I went to college, over 20 years ago now, I picked up guitar and bass because I couldn't play drums in the dorm rooms anymore, and so I would just read tab on the internet, and so I've picked up like horrible finger, like placement. Like I don't use my pinky very well and all sorts of stuff.
Same thing. I learned from Rocksmith, and it does not teach you how to do things properly. But no, it's great. It's great because I learned how to play like lead guitar and stuff, but it doesn't teach you, like, I don't know how to do a proper bar chord. I cheat. I got these giant monkey hands, and I have bad hand-eye coordination too. So I suck, and I've been playing for like 30 years, and I suck. I'm not even being like, I'm not as good as like Pete Townsend. I really suck. And I know as an artist, like I don't mind sucking because I enjoy it. And I'm fortunate I have a kind of art that I'm good at.
Right. And you have some sort of outlet, which is good.
So I'm grateful every day for being able to do what I do, and I don't resent it.
All right. I'm going to let you go. But before I do, I wanted to ask you quick. You had brought up a game earlier. I think it was Moon Studios' new game, right?
No Rest for Wicked.
Right. So are you playing anything interesting that you wanted to, like, what do you keep him busy with? Or are you just busy with the game? I assume you must not have too much time, but I assume you probably still get sucked into your
I think it's really important that people like me play games. So like just my recent list on Steam is, I'm playing Wild Bastards, which is my co-founder of Rational, John Che's new game, which is really cool. If you like, there's a game called Void Bastards he did, which is, it's sort of the follow-up. Balatro I've been playing, No Rest for the Wicked, Rogue Legacy 2, Dave the Diver I loved. What was it? What's the Lovecraftian boat game? Dredge.
Oh, Dredge, right. Yeah. Right.
And every time there's a Steam like demo fest, I'll like download all the demos. So I play Inscription, Undermine. I play. I just downloaded a Call of Duty game, Black Ops, because I haven't played a lot of those recently. So I always like to see what's going on.
Awesome.
So I play a lot, and I play a very diverse range of things.
That's great. Yeah, I think that people are going to be pleased to hear that. And that is vital to experience other art. I wouldn't be able to imagine not. I always tell people, I mean, it's the great artist steal line, I guess, but all of my ideas in the games that I've written come from other things. Like it's not like, like everything,
I mean, we're all basically like the large language model. We have a huge database of stuff in our head, and we're just combining things and merging things, and then adding whatever our self is, whatever Colin is or whatever Ken is, that gets pasted on top of it. And it's sort of this, Frankenstein of all these other influences and whatever we bring to it. So yeah, you got to play games. It's free. When I was a kid, I remember like when I was a writer, I was like, oh, research sounds boring. And then they're like, oh no, research is like free material for you.
Definitely. I'll never forget going into Amy Hennig's office when I wrote the history of Naughty Dog when I was at IGN many years ago. And her entire office was just covered in books, VHS tapes, and DVDs. Like no joke, like hundreds of these things. And I was like, Jesus, it almost like it was set up that way to be so impressive to me, but it wasn't. Like that's the way she did it, and I was like, wow, this is crazy.
No, you got to have, I mean, Amy's a genius, and she's got I'm sure like most creative geniuses, they are fans first.
Definitely.
They fell in love with something and they're like, I need to do that. I want to do that. And I'm sure whether it's Amy or whether it's Dave or, or Sven, from Baldur's Gate or whoever, it's going to be they're fans of something and they just want it. Can I do that? Can I do that? That's so, and when you find you can, it's like finding a secret, I'm sure you have this experience, like finding a secret room in your house that you didn't know existed.
Truly.
It's magic.
Truly. And I'm always so excited. It happens all the time when I discover something and I was like, why didn't I ever watch this? Or why didn't I ever see this? Or how did I not know about this? Got constantly. There's just so much good stuff out there. Yeah. Ken, I appreciate you, my friend. I know you're busy. I know you're focused. So I thank you for taking the time for our modest podcast to come and speak to us. I hope we can do it again
soon. On the show because we talk about things I don't talk about with anybody else. Like I didn't know we were getting into the AI thing, and I've been wanting to pontificate about it. So I hope I didn't talk your ear off. But
not at all, man.
I love coming on the show, and we should do it again.
Yeah, I hope we can. Thank you. Good luck as you continue your journey making this game, and best to the team, best to your wife, best to everyone.
Great.
You can be found. You're usually on. I mean, as far as social media, Twitter is where.
Yeah, I think I'm at Levine, Levine. Okay. I don't post much because, but I'm gonna. Yeah, probably. I should post more about games I'm playing, games I like. But I read it all. I read. I as much as I don't like posting on, I do like reading all the crazy shit.
Oh yeah, I read it too, and people have been doing those pretty cool. I'd like to ape it at some point, maybe next year, where they do like the every game they played that year, and they just post about each game in a thread. And they'll just update that thread as they go. It might be a nice journalistic way to follow things up. But yeah, we'll get together again soon. Appreciate you. Appreciate all of you out there for your love, kindness, and support of Sacred Symbols and Last Stand. Couldn't do it without you. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.